It was another late afternoon in the office, and I was wrapping up some paperwork when my boss, Mrs. Jennings, called me into her office. Mrs. Jennings was an imposing woman, sharp, focused, and always impeccably dressed. At 60, she commanded respect with her presence alone. I'd only been working there a few months, but she was the kind of boss that everyone admired and feared a little too. "Jeff, could you come in here for a minute?" Her voice was calm but firm, the kind that left no room for argument. I grabbed my notepad and quickly made my way down the hall to her office. As I entered, she was sitting at her desk, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she glanced up at me. The late afternoon sun poured in through the windows behind her, casting a golden glow around the room. "Close the door, please," she said, without looking up. I did as she asked, feeling a strange nervousness settle in my chest. She rarely called me into her office unless it was something serious, and I wasn't sure what to expect. She gestured to the chair in front of her desk. "Sit down." I sat, my palms sweating slightly. Mrs. Jennings looked up from the paperwork she'd been studying, her sharp blue eyes locking onto mine. There was something different about the way she looked at me today, softer almost. "You've been doing good work around here, Jeff," she said, leaning back in her chair. "I've noticed." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "Thank you, Mrs. Jennings. I'm just trying to do my best." She smiled slightly, her gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary. "I can see that." She stood up, walking slowly around the desk to stand beside me. I could feel her presence, her eyes never leaving me as she moved. "You know," she began, her voice lowering just a bit, "it's not often that someone your age shows the kind of dedication and focus that you have." Her hand rested on the edge of the desk behind me, leaning in just slightly. The scent of her perfume was subtle but intoxicating, and I couldn't help but feel my pulse quicken. "Thank you," I said again, my voice a little shaky. I wasn't sure where this was going, but the air between us had shifted, and I couldn't ignore it. Her fingers brushed lightly against my shoulder as she spoke again. "But there's more to success than just hard work, Jeff." Her touch lingered for a moment longer than it should have, and I felt a jolt of something I couldn't quite place. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. "I understand," I managed to say. She leaned down slightly, her face closer to mine now, her eyes studying me intently. "Do you?" she asked softly, her hand trailing down my arm in a way that made my skin tingle. "There are other skills that are just as important, knowing how to navigate certain situations." Her words hung in the air, and I felt my heart racing in my chest. I didn't know what to say, but I could feel the tension between us thickening with every passing second. Mrs. Jennings moved even closer, her lips just inches from my ear. "You're a smart young man, Jeff. I think you know what I'm talking about." Before I could respond, her hand slid down to my knee, the heat from her touch searing through my pants. I froze, my mind spinning, unsure of how to react. This was my boss, someone I respected and admired, but the way she was touching me, the way she was looking at me, was impossible to ignore. Her lips brushed against my ear as she whispered, "I can help you go far here, Jeff, if you want it." The offer hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. My breath caught in my throat as her hand moved further up my thigh, her fingers grazing dangerously close to the edge of something that made my entire body tense. I don't know," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Jennings pulled back slightly, her eyes locking onto mine again. There was a fire in her gaze, something that both thrilled and terrified me at the same time. "You don't have to be nervous," she said softly, her hand still resting on my thigh. "I can make things very easy for you." Her other hand reached up, brushing a stray hair from my forehead before gently cupping my cheek. I felt my pulse quicken as her thumb grazed my skin, her touch soft but deliberate. My body reacted instinctively, leaning slightly into her touch despite the voice in my head telling me this was wrong. She smiled, her lips curving into a knowing smirk. "That's it, Jeff," she murmured, her hand sliding further up my thigh. "Just relax." Before I knew what was happening, she leaned in and pressed her lips against mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, but there was a hunger behind it that caught me off guard. I froze for a moment, unsure of what to do, but then I felt myself kissing her back, my hands instinctively moving to her waist. The kiss deepened, and I felt her fingers weave into my hair, pulling me closer. Every nerve in my body was on fire, the electricity between us undeniable. Mrs. Jennings wasn't just my boss anymore. In that moment, she was something else entirely, something that made my heart race and my thoughts blur. Her hands roamed down my chest, her touch sending shivers through me. I could feel the heat of her body against mine, and it was all I could do to keep myself from completely losing control. She pulled back slightly, her lips hovering just inches from mine as she whispered, "You're doing well, Jeff. Very well." My breath was shaky, my thoughts a jumbled mess. "Mrs. Jennings, I don't know if this is—" "Shh," she interrupted, placing a finger over my lips. "There's no need to overthink it." She leaned in, kissing me again, her hands pulling me closer as her body pressed against mine. Time seemed to blur as we lost ourselves in the moment. All the boundaries I thought existed between us melted away. There was no office, no professional distance, no rules. Just the two of us, wrapped in something I couldn't quite understand, but didn't want to stop. When she finally pulled away, her lips were swollen, her eyes dark with desire. "You're going to do great things here, Jeff," she whispered, her voice thick with promise. "I'll make sure of it." I sat there breathless and dazed, my mind still trying to catch up with everything that had just happened. Mrs. Jennings straightened her blouse, her composure returning as she moved back behind her desk. "You can go now," she said, her voice calm once again, though the look in her eyes told me this wasn't the end. I stood up, my legs a little shaky as I headed for the door. As I reached for the handle, she called after me, "Jeff?" I turned to look at her, my heart still racing. "Remember what we talked about," she said, a knowing smile playing on her lips. "You've got potential." I nodded, my throat dry, before quickly leaving her office, my mind spinning with everything that had just transpired. I walked out of Mrs. Jennings' office, my head still spinning, trying to process everything that had just happened. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could still feel the warmth of her touch lingering on my skin. I made my way back to my desk, but it was impossible to focus. My thoughts kept drifting back to the way her lips had felt against mine, the way she had looked at me with that mix of control and desire. For the next few days, things were different in the office. Every time I passed by Mrs. Jennings' office, I felt her eyes on me. It was subtle, but I knew she was watching me, waiting for me to acknowledge what had happened. I avoided her as much as I could, keeping my head down and focusing on my work. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of that afternoon. A week later, she called me back into her office. My stomach twisted with a mix of anticipation and anxiety as I made my way to her door. I knocked softly, and her voice called me in. "Jeff," she said, smiling warmly as I stepped inside. "Come in." "Close the door." I obeyed, feeling that same strange nervousness creeping back into my chest. Mrs. Jennings was sitting at her desk, her legs crossed, looking as composed and confident as ever. "I've been thinking about you," she said, her eyes locking onto mine, "about the potential I see in you." I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "Thank you, Mrs. Jennings." She smiled, standing up and walking over to me. "You don't have to be so formal with me, Jeff. Call me Laura." Her hands rested lightly on my arms, and I felt a familiar heat rise between us. She was close again, too close. The tension in the air was palpable, and I could feel my body reacting to her presence despite the little voice in my head telling me to be careful. I meant what I said last week, she continued, her voice soft but insistent. You have a bright future here if you play your cards right. Her hand trailed down my arm, sending shivers through me. She leaned in, her lips brushing against my ear as she whispered, "And I think you know how to do that." Before I could respond, she kissed me again, her lips hungry, demanding. I tried to resist at first, but the pull was too strong. I found myself kissing her back, my hands gripping her waist as she pressed herself against me. The fire between us reignited, and all thoughts of right and wrong blurred in the heat of the moment. Her hands were everywhere, roaming my chest, my back, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. She broke the kiss, her breathing heavy, her eyes dark with desire. "This is just the beginning, Jeff," she murmured, her hand resting on my cheek. "You and I, we could go so far together." I stood there, my mind racing, trying to process what she was saying. I knew what she was offering, an unspoken agreement that went far beyond the boundaries of professionalism. But even as my heart raced and my body reacted to her touch, a part of me knew this was a dangerous path. I need to think about it," I stammered, pulling back slightly, trying to regain some sense of control. Mrs. Jennings, or Laura as she had asked me to call her, smiled softly, her hand still resting on my chest. "Take your time, Jeff. I'm not going anywhere." Her fingers traced a line down my chest before she stepped back, giving me some space. "I believe in you," she said, her voice soft but full of meaning. "When you are ready, you know where to find me." I nodded, swallowing hard, as I turned and left her office. My heart was pounding, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I knew I was playing with fire, but the pull of her offer, of her, was hard to ignore. For the next few days, I kept my distance, focusing on my work, trying to clear my head. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of her touch, her kiss, the promise in her words. Every time I saw her, whether in meetings or passing by her office, I felt the tension between us, like a live wire just waiting to spark. Then one afternoon, she called me into her office again. This time, I knew what was coming. I could feel it in the air as I walked down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. When I stepped inside, she was standing by the window, her back to me. She turned when she heard me enter, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Jeff," she said softly, her eyes locking onto mine. "I've been waiting for you." I didn't say anything, but I could feel the pull between us, stronger than ever. She walked toward me, her movement slow and deliberate, until she was standing right in front of me, her hand resting lightly on my chest. "You've thought about what I said, haven't you?" she whispered, her lips just inches from mine. I nodded, unable to find the words. She smiled, her hand trailing down my arm, her touch sending shivers through me. "Good," she murmured, leaning in to kiss me once more, sealing the unspoken agreement between us. From that moment on, everything changed. Laura and I became something more than just boss and employee, something that existed in the quiet corners of the office, behind closed doors, in stolen moments where the lines between professional and personal blurred. It was exhilarating, dangerous, and completely consuming. But deep down, I knew that this was a game that couldn't last forever. The question was, how far would it go before everything came crashing down?